War has a way of revealing the truth about machines. On the drawing board, everything looks perfect. The numbers, the armor thickness, the horsepower, the gun caliber. But when steel meets mud, when engines roar in battle, and when a soldier's life depends on the machine under him, theory either stands firm or crumbles under reality. During World War II, two tanks represented this lesson more clearly than any others: Britain's Cromwell and America's M4 Sherman. Both were designed to be fast, reliable, and capable of turning the tide of war. Yet while the Sherman became one of the most successful tanks in history, the Cromwell never lived up to its potential. The contrast between these two machines is a study in design philosophy, industrial might, and the brutal demands of modern warfare. In the early years of the war, Britain was desperate to modernize its armored forces. The tanks that rolled into France in 1940 were a patchwork of designs, some fast but fragile, others heavily armored but painfully slow. The British Army was still clinging to a pre-war theory that divided tanks into two main categories: infantry tanks, which advanced slowly with foot soldiers, and cruiser tanks, which were meant to race ahead, exploit breakthroughs, and strike deep into enemy territory. The Cromwell was born out of that second idea, a fast, maneuverable tank that could outrun and outflank the enemy. On paper, it sounded brilliant. In practice, it would expose the limits of Britain's wartime industry and the dangers of rushing innovation under fire. The Cromwell story begins with a powerful but problematic engine, the Rolls-Royce Meteor. It was derived from the legendary Merlin engine that powered the Spitfire and the Hurricane, two aircraft that had saved Britain during the Battle of Britain. Engineers saw a chance to use that same raw power on the ground. The Meteor was stripped of its superchargers and adapted for tank use, giving the Cromwell an astonishing top speed of nearly 40 miles per hour, faster than almost any tank of its time. But with that speed came fragility. The Cromwell suspension and drivetrain struggled to handle the engine's power. In long marches, components overheated or failed entirely. The engine demanded high-quality fuel and careful maintenance, luxuries that frontline tank crews could rarely afford. What was meant to be Britain's mechanical miracle became, for many crews, a temperamental beast that needed constant attention. The problems didn't stop there. British industry in the 1940s was stretched to the breaking point. The country was under siege, factories were bombed, and resources were scarce. Designing a tank that was fast, reliable, and powerful was one thing. Producing it in huge numbers was another. The Cromwell was assembled from a mix of parts from different contractors, often with variations in standards. Some had engines that worked beautifully, others barely started in the cold. Spare parts were limited, and repair crews struggled to keep the tanks running in the field. The result was an armored force that looked impressive in parades, but often faltered when the battle lasted longer than a day. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States had entered the war with a very different philosophy. When American engineers designed the M4 Sherman, they weren't chasing perfection, they were chasing practicality. The U.S. Army and its manufacturers understood that a tank was only as good as the supply chain that kept it moving. The Sherman wasn't the fastest, the most heavily armed, or the best armored tank on the battlefield, but it was the most dependable. Its engine could start in freezing conditions or scorching deserts. Its transmission was smooth, its suspension forgiving, and its components interchangeable across thousands of units. The Sherman could be built by the tens of thousands, shipped overseas, and repaired with parts from any depot on the planet. It was a machine designed not just for war, but for global war. When British and American forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, the differences between the two tanks became obvious. Cromwell tanks, assigned to British armoured divisions, dazzled observers with their speed. They raced across fields and roads with agility that German crews often underestimated. In open country fighting, they could outmaneuver heavier Panzer IVs and even occasionally dance around the slower Tiger tanks. But that agility came at a price. After long road marches, the Cromwell's engines often overheated. Tracks wore out quickly, transmissions jammed, and crews found themselves stopping more often to fix problems than to fight. The Sherman, meanwhile, just kept going. American tankers joked that their machines might not be glamorous, but they'd get you home. And that wasn't an exaggeration. Some Sherman units drove over 2,000 miles through France and into Germany without a single catastrophic breakdown, a level of reliability unheard of in armored warfare at the time. To understand why the Sherman could endure what the Cromwell couldn't, you have to look at how each nation approached engineering. British tank design was guided by small groups of officers, engineers and committees, each with their own vision. Changes were constant. New guns were requested, armor configurations altered, and prototypes endlessly tweaked. The result was a series of tanks that never quite reached maturity. By the time the Cromwell entered mass production, newer designs like the Comet were already being developed to fix its flaws. The Americans took the opposite approach. Once the Sherman's blueprint was approved, it was frozen. Instead of chasing new versions every few months, they improved the same core model steadily. Factories built the same parts, mechanics learned the same systems, and soldiers knew exactly how to fix what broke. Consistency, not creativity, became their secret weapon. Another key difference lay in philosophy. Britain's engineers prioritized performance, speed, power, and agility. America's prioritized endurance, how far a tank could go without a major failure. The Cromwell's engine produced over 600 horsepower, giving it incredible speed, but also immense mechanical stress. The Sherman's engines, especially the reliable radial and later Ford V8 types, produced around 400 to 500 horsepower, enough to move the tank efficiently without overloading its systems. The result was a slower tank that simply refused to quit. American crews could drive hundreds of miles between battles, refuel, rearm, and go again. British crews, by contrast, often found themselves waiting for repairs or replacements. Then came the issue of logistics. The United States had something Britain simply didn't: massive industrial capacity. Detroit was the heart of global manufacturing, capable of producing thousands of tanks per month. American factories turned out parts with precision and uniformity that ensured every Sherman, no matter where it was built, could share components. Britain's wartime industry, though innovative, was small and fragmented. Different companies built different versions of the Cromwell, some with subtle design variations that made parts incompatible. In combat, that meant if your tank broke down, the nearest spare part might not fit. In a war that depended on momentum, that kind of problem could be fatal. There was also the matter of terrain and tactics. In North Africa, earlier British cruiser tanks had already shown how fragile high-speed designs could be in harsh environments. Dust-clogged filters, engines overheated, and suspensions snapped. The Cromwell inherited some of those weaknesses, even though it was far superior to the Crusader and Cavalier models that came before it. The Sherman, meanwhile, was tested and adapted for multiple fronts, from desert sands to jungle mud to European cities. It wasn't perfect, but its flexibility made it invaluable. The tank's ability to handle long distances with minimal maintenance became one of its greatest strengths. For commanders planning massive offensives, knowing that a column of Shermans could move day after day without major mechanical failures changed the very nature of the campaign. One of the most telling stories came from the push through France after D-Day. American divisions often advanced 50 to 100 miles in a single day, something no army had done before with such heavy equipment. Sherman crews drove over destroyed bridges, through bombed-out towns, and along roads littered with wreckage. Yet their tanks kept running. In contrast, British Cromwell units advancing in parallel sometimes lagged behind, not because of the crew's courage or tactics, but because the tanks simply couldn't keep up mechanically. Field reports often described overheating issues, engine fires, and mechanical breakdowns during long-distance movements. Engineers worked tirelessly to fix these problems, but the underlying design just wasn't built for endurance. Another critical factor was crew experience and comfort. The Sherman was designed with the human element in mind. Its interior was relatively spacious, its controls well laid out, and its hatches easy to operate. If the Sherman was hit, crews had a good chance of escaping. The Cromwell, by contrast, was cramped and uncomfortable. The Meteor engine's roar made communication difficult, and the interior heat could become unbearable during long missions. In theory, the Cromwell could hit and run faster than most German tanks. In reality, the physical toll on the crew often reduced its effectiveness. Fatigue and mechanical strain combined into a deadly mix that sapped morale and performance over time. Yet, to be fair, the Cromwell was not a complete failure. When it worked, it was an exceptional machine. It could accelerate faster than most Allied tanks. Its low profile made it harder to hit, and its armor was thick enough to withstand medium-caliber German guns. In the right conditions, short, high-intensity battles, it was lethal. British commanders admired its speed during operations like the breakout from Normandy, where Cromwell squadrons swept across the countryside to liberate towns ahead of schedule. But reliability remained its Achilles heel. Every mile increased the risk of failure. Every hour of operation brought new maintenance challenges. The same high-performance design that made it special also made it fragile. Meanwhile, the Sherman's reputation continued to grow. Soldiers trusted it. Mechanics understood it. Commanders could rely on it. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, a tank that turned the art of war into an industrial science. Its reliability allowed Allied forces to plan large-scale maneuvers without fear of mechanical collapse. It could climb hills, ford rivers, and cross makeshift bridges without much trouble. In the chaos of war, that kind of predictability was priceless. The contrast between these two tanks wasn't just mechanical, it was cultural. Britain's engineering tradition prized craftsmanship, innovation, and precision. America's prized production, standardization, and simplicity. The Cromwell was like a finely tuned sports car, fast and agile, but demanding constant maintenance. The Sherman was like a dependable truck, maybe less exciting, but it got the job done every single time. When the war turned into a battle of logistics, the Sherman's philosophy proved superior. By 1945, the results spoke for themselves. Over 49,000 Sherman tanks had been built, serving in every theater of the war. They crossed deserts, jungles, and mountains. They fought in the Pacific Islands, in Italy, in the frozen forests of Belgium. Many were still running years after the war ended, used by armies around the world. The Cromwell, by comparison, saw limited production, only around 4,000 units, and by the time it reached its peak, newer designs like the Comet had already replaced it. Britain had learned its lesson the hard way. Performance without reliability was a luxury no army could afford. In the end, the difference between the Cromwell and the Sherman wasn't just about which tank was better, it was about which tank was built for the world's first truly global war. The Sherman wasn't designed to win duels, it was designed to win campaigns. It was the embodiment of an industrial nation at full strength, producing machines that could march across continents without stopping. The Cromwell was a bold experiment, an attempt to push the limits of technology in the midst of chaos. It failed not because it was bad, but because Britain tried to do too much with too little, too fast. And so, when history remembers the Sherman for running 2,000 miles without braking, it's not just remembering a tank, it's remembering an idea that in war, reliability is the ultimate weapon. If the Cromwell was Britain's fast but fragile racer, the Sherman was America's steady workhorse. And that reliability didn't just save machines, it saved lives. In the brutal conditions of World War II, a tank breaking down at the wrong moment could mean the difference between life and death. For a crew under fire, the ability to start the engine, move out, and fight another day was everything. German crews developed deep trust in their vehicles. They called them Old Faithful or Honey, names that reflected affection, not fear. There was comfort in knowing that when the order came to advance, their machine would obey. Cromwell crews, on the other hand, respected their tank's speed and firepower, but never stopped worrying about its temperamental nature. Many British reports described the Meteor engine as magnificent but moody, a thoroughbred in a world that needed draft horses. The reliability of the Sherman wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. A dependable tank created confidence, and confidence created aggression. Commanders could plan larger operations without worrying about whether their armor would physically make the journey. That trust in the machine allowed Allied forces to push harder, move faster, and recover quicker after every fight. The Cromwell, in contrast, required caution. Units had to plan maintenance stops, carry more spare parts, and allocate mechanics to handle frequent repairs. Every hour spent fixing a tank was an hour lost in momentum. And in war, momentum is everything. Perhaps the most powerful symbol of this difference came during the Allied advance into Germany in 1945. As the front lines moved eastward, the logistical challenge became enormous. Tanks had to drive hundreds of miles through bombed-out towns, across rivers, and over makeshift bridges. The Sherman handled it with quiet endurance. Entire armored columns crossed half of Europe with their original engines still running. Mechanics marveled at how these machines, often battered and patched, still refused to die. One famous account tells of a Sherman that drove nearly 2,000 miles from Normandy to Czechoslovakia, requiring nothing more than oil checks and track tightening. No one would have dared expect such performance from a Cromwell. The British tanks fought bravely, but they often ended up on transporters, being hauled back for repairs, while the American columns pressed forward on their own power. The British Army recognized the issue and began to adapt. By late 1944, many British armored units replaced or supplemented their Cromwells with American-built Shermans, especially the Sherman Firefly, a hybrid that combined the Sherman's reliable chassis with Britain's powerful 17-pounder anti-tank gun. It was a match made out of necessity, but proved devastatingly effective. The Firefly became the best of both worlds, American reliability and British firepower. That decision said everything. When war tested both nations' machines, the one that could endure, not the one that could sprint, carried the day. After the war, the lessons of the Cromwell and the Sherman reshaped tank design philosophy forever. Britain's next generation of tanks, like the Comet and the Centurion, learned from the Cromwell's failures. They prioritized durability, maintainability, and modular construction over sheer performance. The Centurion, in particular, went on to become one of the most successful post-war tanks ever built, a true masterpiece that balanced power with reliability. In a sense, the Cromwell walked so the Centurion could run. It was the necessary stepping stone, a painful lesson that innovation without simplicity leads to fragility. For the Americans, the Sherman became a legend not because it was the most powerful tank of its time, but because it embodied the essence of wartime engineering. Build what works. Build a lot of it and make sure it never quits. Its design became the backbone of armored warfare for years after 1945. Many nations continued to use Shermans well into the 1960s, modifying and upgrading them for modern combat. The tank's DNA lived on in every U.S. design that followed, from the Pershing to the Patton and beyond. Even decades later, veterans spoke of the Sherman not with fear or resentment, but with fondness. It wasn't perfect, but it was loyal, and in war, loyalty mattered. The Cromwell, meanwhile, faded quietly into history. It was respected, but not revered, remembered more for what it tried to be than for what it accomplished. For British engineers, it represented ambition under pressure, a symbol of wartime ingenuity stretched to its limits. For historians, it remains a fascinating what-if. What if Britain had the industrial power to refine it further? What if the Meteor engine had been tamed sooner? Perhaps it could have rivaled the Sherman in reliability. But history doesn't reward potential. It rewards performance. When you look at wartime photographs of a Sherman parked next to a Cromwell, they might seem like equals. Both are sturdy, purposeful machines bristling with power and intent. But inside, they tell two completely different stories, one of industrial scale and predictability, the other of engineering brilliance constrained by reality. The Sherman was a tank built to be maintained in a muddy field by a mechanic with a wrench. The Cromwell was a tank that wanted to be treated like a sports car in a world that had no time for finesse. In the end, that's why the Sherman succeeded where the Cromwell faltered. The Sherman wasn't faster or tougher or deadlier. It was simply there when it was needed most. It could be driven across a continent, battered by shells, caked in mud, and still start the next morning. It could be repaired on the battlefield, not in a factory. It could be trusted. And in the chaos of World War II, trust was worth more than armor. The story of these two tanks isn't just about machines, it's about philosophies. It's about how two nations viewed war itself. Britain, under siege and struggling for resources, tried to outthink the enemy with design. America, fueled by vast industry and endless supply lines, focused on outlasting the enemy with reliability. The Cromwell dazzled on the proving grounds, but stumbled in the field. The Sherman, underestimated and often mocked, quietly carried the Allies to victory. So, when history asks why Britain's Cromwell failed, while America's Sherman ran 2,000 miles without braking, the answer lies not in horsepower or armor thickness, but in mindset. The Cromwell was built to perform. The Sherman was built to endure. And in the brutal test of total war, endurance always wins, because when everything depends on whether a tank will move when you turn the key, you choose the one that always starts.